The knock came at 3 a.m., hard knuckles against cold glass. I'd been asleep for maybe 90 minutes, which was about all my back allowed me anymore in the cab of a pickup truck. 63 years old, and this was where I'd ended up reclined in the driver's seat of a 2009 Ford F-150, parked behind a Dollar General on the edge of Clarksville, Tennessee, with a rolled-up jacket for a pillow and a moving blanket I'd found buried under junk in the truck bed pulled up to my chin. The flashlight beam hit me square in the face before I could reach for my glasses. I fumbled with the door handle. My fingers were stiff. November in Middle Tennessee isn't Alaska, but when you're sleeping in a vehicle with a heater, you're afraid to run too long because you only have a quarter tank of gas. It gets cold enough to matter. The officer was young, maybe 30. He had his hand resting on his belt, not on his weapon, which I took as a good sign. "Sir, you doing all right in there?" "Yes, officer." My voice came out rougher than I expected. "Just resting." "License and registration, please." I reached into the glove box. My hands were shaking, though not from nerves, just the cold and the age and the particular exhaustion that comes from not having slept in a real bed in 11 weeks. He took my license back to his cruiser. I sat there in the dark and watched the red and blue lights paint the Dollar General wall in slow rotations. I thought about how, 2 years ago, I was signing paychecks for 41 employees. I thought about my corner office with the window that looked out over the river. I thought about the morning my partner sat across from me at my own conference table and told me the company no longer needed my involvement. The officer was gone a long time, longer than usual. I watched the cruiser in my rearview mirror. The interior light was on. He was on his radio. "My name is Robert Delaney. Most people who've known me for more than a decade call me Bob. I spent 31 years building Delaney and Associates landscaping and civil grading from a one-man operation out of my garage into one of the most respected land management companies in Middle Tennessee. We did corporate campuses, residential developments, county contracts, highway drainage projects. At our peak, we were clearing close to $4 million a year in revenue. I was 61 when it all came apart. My business partner's name was Gary. We'd worked together for 22 years. He came on as a project manager when my son was still in diapers. Worked his way up. Bought into the partnership when I offered him the chance. I trusted Gary the way you trust someone who's been in the foxhole with you. I trusted him with the books, with the vendor relationships, with the banking. I was the one out in the field. He was the one who handled the business side. That was my mistake. Not trusting him, I'd probably make that same decision again, knowing what I knew then. The mistake was trusting him without verifying. For at least 4 years before everything collapsed, Gary had been routing company funds through a separate LLC he'd created, a company I didn't know existed. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. He'd also been renegotiating vendor contracts in ways that created personal kickbacks, money that went to him and not to the business. By the time I found out, and I only found out because a vendor called me directly to complain about a payment discrepancy he'd taken somewhere between $800,000 and $1 million from the company we'd built together. I went to a lawyer. I went to 2 lawyers. The first one told me what I wanted to hear and then disappeared with a $15,000 retainer. The second one was honest enough to explain what I was actually facing. Gary had already moved most of the money. He'd structured things carefully. Proving intent would take years and cost more than I had. And while all of this was being sorted out, Gary had gone to our primary lender, a bank where he had the relationship, not me, and recharacterized a line of credit in a way that put the company into technical default. The company I'd built for 31 years was dissolved in a Chapter 7 proceeding 14 months after I first found out what Gary had done. I lost the business. I lost the building we'd owned outright, which got swept into the liquidation. My retirement accounts, which I'd been pressured by Gary to invest back into company infrastructure 2 years prior, were gone. My house had a second mortgage I'd taken to cover legal fees, and once the company income stopped, I couldn't make the payments. I was 62 years old and I had a truck, roughly $1,100 in a checking account, and a storage unit with what remained of my furniture. My son didn't call much after that. He'd never been close to Gary, but he also hadn't come to my defense the way I'd hoped. He had his own family, his own mortgage, his own reasons. I understood it. I didn't forgive it, but I understood it. My daughter sent money twice, small amounts, what she could manage. I told her to stop after the second time. She was a teacher with 3 kids. I wasn't going to let her carry me, so I made the truck work. By October, I had a system. I knew which Walmarts let you park overnight without knocking on your window. I knew which rest stops had hot water in the bathrooms. I knew the library branches that opened at 9 and didn't ask questions. I'd found a gym with a month-to-month membership for $32 that gave me a shower every morning. I'd pick up day labor when I could get it. I still knew how to run equipment, still had my certifications, but at 63 my body paid a different price for it than it used to. I wasn't drinking. I want to be clear about that because I think when people imagine a man my age sleeping in a truck, they assume a certain kind of story. My story wasn't that story. I was just a man who had been systematically taken apart by someone I trusted, and who was too proud to move into my daughter's spare room in Murfreesboro and too broke to do anything else. Some nights I would sit in that truck and run the numbers in my head. I'd been a businessman for 3 decades. I understood financial reality. I knew that at 63, starting over from zero wasn't impossible, but it was close enough to impossible that the difference barely mattered. I'd lie there under that moving blanket and think, this is it. This is how it ends. Not in a hospital bed, not surrounded by grandchildren. In a Ford F-150 behind a Dollar General. There were nights when that thought didn't bother me as much as it should have. That scared me more than the cold. The officer was still in his cruiser when I checked the mirror again. 15 minutes had passed. That wasn't normal. A routine welfare check on a sleeping man doesn't take 15 minutes. I watched him get out. He walked back to my truck slower than he'd walked away from it. He had his radio on his shoulder, and it crackled something I couldn't make out. He stopped at my window. He had a different look on his face than before. Not threatening, not suspicious. Something else. Something I couldn't read. Mr. Delaney. He said my name differently. Careful, like it was something breakable. Is your middle name James? It is. And your mother's maiden name? I looked at him. Why are you asking me that? He glanced back at his cruiser, then at me. Sir, can you just answer the question? Calloway, I said. Her name was Calloway before she married my father. He pressed his radio again, said something quietly, turned away. When he turned back, the expression on his face had shifted into something I still couldn't quite name. He looked like a man who had just been told something that didn't fit the world as he understood it. Mr. Delaney, I need to ask you to step out of the vehicle. My stomach dropped. Am I under arrest? No, sir. He shook his head. No. There's a flag on your record. A federal flag. It's been there since 1994. My dispatch is telling me I need to verify your identity in person. He paused. Have you ever been contacted by anyone about a property matter? A trust? Anything involving land in Hardin County? I stared at him. Hardin County, I repeated. Hardin County was where my grandfather had his farm. My grandfather's name was Earl Delaney. He died in 1987 when I was 27 and too busy trying to keep my young business alive to pay close attention to what happened to his estate. I remembered the funeral. I remembered my father handling the paperwork. I remembered being told the farm had been put into some kind of family trust, that there were tax reasons for it, that it would stay in the family. After my father died in 2003, the farm was something we talked about occasionally. 140 acres in Hardin County, about an hour south of Nashville. Mostly timber and creek bottom. My grandfather had farmed it, but it hadn't been actively worked since the 1970s. My father's estate lawyer said there were some unresolved questions about the trust documentation. I'd meant to look into it. Life moved fast when the business was growing. I put it on the back burner and it stayed there. I'd thought about that land sometimes, in the truck, on the bad nights. 140 acres of Tennessee timber wasn't a fortune. but it was something. Except I didn't know how to get to it. Whether the trust was still valid, whether my cousins had any claim, whether the county had taken it for back taxes. I didn't have a lawyer. I barely had gas money. I had no idea that, while I was sleeping in parking lots, something had been happening with that land. The officer didn't arrest me. He didn't handcuff me. He asked me to sit in the back of his cruiser, not unkindly, and he made a phone call that lasted almost 20 minutes while I sat there in the warm car smelling like the Dollar General parking lot. When he got off the phone, he turned and looked at me through the partition. "Mr. Delaney, there's a federal probate flag on your name that's been active since 1994. It means any law enforcement database check of your ID is supposed to trigger a notification to a holding agency." He paused. "Do you know the name Callaway Land Holdings?" I shook my head. "Your grandfather, Earl James Delaney, set up a land trust in 1981. When he died, the trust transferred to your father. When your father died, it was supposed to transfer to you. The problem was, the successor trustee documentation named your father as the administrator. And when he passed, nobody filed the proper transfer with the court. The trust went into a kind of legal limbo. It's been sitting in the Hardin County probate system for 20 years, accruing property taxes that were being covered by a separate escrow account your grandfather set up." He said that again. An escrow account. Money set aside specifically to pay the property taxes on that land for as long as the trust remained in legal limbo. "Is the land still there?" I asked. My voice didn't sound like my voice. "Yes, sir." He looked at me with that expression again, like the world had rearranged itself slightly and he wasn't sure yet how to navigate the new version. "And there's something else. About 4 years ago, a developer started buying up land in that corridor. Most of the Hardin County parcels in that stretch have been acquired for a logistics and distribution complex. Your grandfather's parcel sits right in the middle of the planned access road." He stopped talking. Gave me a moment. "They've been trying to find you for 3 years, he said. "The developer, the probate court. They couldn't locate you because you'd moved so many times in the past 2 years. The federal flag, the one that just lit up my screen, was put there by a probate attorney trying to find the rightful heir." I sat in the back of that police cruiser for a long time without saying anything. Outside, the Dollar General sign hummed in the darkness. The parking lot was empty, except for my truck, sitting there with the moving blanket visible through the rear window. 63 years old, $1,100 in the bank, sleeping in a parking lot. And my grandfather had been keeping a piece of land for me for 40 years without me even knowing it. I won't pretend that what followed was simple. Nothing involving probate court, successor trusteeship, and a development negotiation is ever simple, and I was a man without a lawyer, without money for a retainer, and with credit that had been destroyed by the company collapse. The officer, his name was Marcus, and I will remember his name for the rest of my life, sat with me in that parking lot until almost 5 in the morning. He made calls I didn't ask him to make. He reached a duty attorney at the county public defender's office who specialized in civil matters and left a message. He wrote down 3 names and phone numbers on a notepad and tore the page out and handed it through the partition to me. "I've never seen anything quite like this," he said, and he didn't say it in a way that felt patronizing. He said it like a man who had been a cop long enough to have seen most things and was genuinely surprised to be presented with something outside his catalog. I thanked him. I meant it with everything I had. I slept 2 more hours in the truck after he left, and when I woke up at 7 o'clock, I sat there in the cold and tried to understand what my life was. The probate attorney's name was Sandra. She was 60 herself, with reading glasses on a chain around her neck and the particular directness of someone who had spent decades cutting through other people's confusion to find the actual facts underneath. She met me the next morning in her office, which smelled like coffee and old files, and she listened to my entire story without once looking at her watch. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The trust is valid," she said. "Your grandfather's attorney drafted it well. The only problem was the failure to re-register after your father's death, and that's a procedural issue we can correct. In terms of your ownership claim, it's not contested. You're the sole heir named in the document." She pulled a folder from a drawer, set it on the desk between us. The developer's offer, she said, is currently sitting at $2.3 million for the parcel. They've been holding that offer open for 14 months while the probate court attempted to locate you. She paused. That offer is very likely to increase if you indicate willingness to negotiate rather than simply accept. I heard the number. I looked at the folder. I thought about Gary sitting across from me at my own conference table, telling me the company no longer needed my involvement. I thought about him in that moment, the way he'd kept his voice calm, almost apologetic, the way he'd had his lawyer already present when I walked in, like I was a detail to be managed. I thought about the morning I watched the locksmith change the locks on the building I'd owned for 19 years. I thought about my son, who hadn't called. I thought about my daughter, who had sent what she could from a teacher's salary. I thought about the morning at the gym when I was standing at the sink shaving, and the man in the mirror looked so old and so hollowed out that I stood there for a full minute not recognizing him. And I thought about my grandfather, Earl James Delaney, who had farmed that land in Hardin County and then set it aside in a trust with an escrow account to pay its taxes, as if he'd somehow known that there would come a day when one of his own would need something solid to stand on. I don't believe in coincidences at my age. I'm not sure I believe in much of anything supernatural, but I believe in the particular grace of being caught when you're falling, and I believe that the people who love us sometimes reach across time in ways we don't fully understand. The negotiation took 4 months. Sandra earned every cent of her fee, which she reduced significantly when she understood my situation. The final number was $2,800,000, which included an easement agreement that allowed the developer to use a corridor of the land while I retained timber rights on the remaining acreage. I didn't tell Gary. I didn't call him, didn't write him, didn't give him any warning of what was coming. I let Sandra and her colleagues work quietly while Gary apparently continued his life under the impression that I was somewhere at the bottom of whatever hole he'd put me in. What he didn't know was that Sandra had also connected me with a former colleague of hers, a litigator who specialized in business fraud. Once I had resources, once I was no longer a man sleeping in a truck with $1,100 to his name, the calculus of that legal fight changed entirely. The civil case against Gary took 16 months. His carefully structured LLC turned out to be not as carefully structured as he'd believed, and a forensic accountant we hired found things in the financial records that Gary's own attorney hadn't known were there. The judgment was significant. Not everything I'd lost. You can never get back the years, the employees, the thing you built, but substantial. Enough to matter. More importantly, the state licensing board received a formal complaint, backed by the financial documentation. Gary had held a contractor's license, which he'd used to generate business relationships that were part of how he'd run the fraud. That license was revoked. I heard through a former employee that Gary's new business venture, the one he'd started with the money he'd taken from me, had not been going well even before the civil judgment. When the judgment came through, the business folded. I didn't feel what I expected to feel. I thought I'd feel satisfaction. What I felt was mostly tired. Not the tired of the truck, not the cold exhaustion of those 11 weeks, a different kind. The tired of having carried something heavy for a long time and finally setting it down. I bought a small house in Columbia, Tennessee, about 40 minutes from where I used to live. 3 bedrooms, a decent yard, nothing extravagant. I wanted a place where my daughter and her kids could come stay, where there was a room for each grandchild, where Sunday mornings could feel like something again. My son called me 6 weeks after word got around about the settlement. I won't pretend that call didn't happen, and I won't pretend I handled it with perfect grace. I'm human. I said some things I'd been saving for a long time, and so did he. And there were parts of that conversation that were genuinely painful for both of us. But we're talking now. We're working on it. He came to Thanksgiving with his family. We sat at the same table. That's something. My daughter cried when I called her and told her what had happened with the land. She cried again when I transferred money back to her account, not just what she'd sent me, but several times that amount, and told her to take her kids somewhere nice for the summer. She told me I didn't have to do that. I told her she was right. I didn't have to. She understood what I meant. I still drive the 2009 F-150. People ask me why I haven't bought something newer, something nicer, something appropriate for a man who no longer needs to worry about gas money. But there's something about that truck that I'm not ready to let go of yet. I keep the moving blanket in the back, not because I need it. Not as some kind of performance of humility or a reminder to stay grateful, though I won't pretend there isn't something of that in it too. I keep it because on the nights when I'm lying in my real bed, in my real house, and the anxiety comes, and it still comes. I know I can go out to the truck and touch that blanket and remember that I survived the worst version of my own life. That the thing that saved me was something my grandfather set in motion before I was old enough to understand what property law was. That an officer named Marcus ran my license on a cold November night, and something on a computer screen made him pause, made him call, dispatch, made him walk back to my truck with a different expression than the one he'd left with. That my grandfather's land sat in a county probate file for 20 years, quiet and patient, paying its own taxes out of an account set up by a man who wanted to make sure his family had something solid to hold on to. I'm 64 now. When people ask me what I do, I tell them I'm retired. When they ask what I did before, I tell them I was in land management for 30 years, which is true enough. What I don't usually tell people what I'm telling you now is that the most important thing I ever learned about survival, I didn't learn from building a business or growing a company or any of the things I spent 30 years being proud of. I learned it in a parking lot behind a Dollar General at 3 in the morning, sitting in the back of a police cruiser with a moving blanket in my truck and $1,100 in my bank account, listening to a young officer struggle to explain something that the computer in his cruiser had just told him. Some things that are owed to you wait longer than they should, but they wait.